Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, depending on what time zone you're logging in from. We welcome you. My name is Michael Berry. I'm the director of the UCLA Center for Chinese Studies. It's our great pleasure to have everybody back virtually for yet another event. We really appreciate everyone's support of coming back week after week to our various activities. I do want to give a little advertisement. We do have one other event this week that will be tomorrow evening, Pacific Standard Time at 8 p.m. We'll be welcoming Susan Chan Egan and Bai Xianyong, and they will be talking about their new English language version of Bai Xianyong's reader of Dream of the Red Chamber. And so please join us online tomorrow for that and check our website to log into our mailing list to be up to date on future events. It's my great pleasure now to welcome everyone to today's event. And I'm going to hand the reins over to my colleague, Huijun Mai, who is a professor in Asian languages and cultures. And she will be introducing our speaker today. And I will also hand over the moderating duties to Professor Mai as well. And so please join me in welcoming Huijun to the stage to moderate the events. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. My name is Huijun Mai, and I'm the assistant professor at UCLA, assistant professor in medieval Chinese studies. And before we start, let me say a few words to introduce Professor Xin Wen, our guest speaker for today. I have known Xin from our old days at Harvard, and I have enjoyed a great many times talking to him and learning so much about his projects on Silk Road and also on many other things. So Xin graduated from Harvard University with a PhD degree in Inner Asia and Altaic Studies in 2017, after which he has been teaching as an assistant professor at Princeton University. And Xin Wen's research covers a very extensive and impressive range of questions, methodologies, and even disciplines. And based on the many conversations we had over the years, I'm very, very excited to be so privileged to hear about his newest and upcoming book project. So Xin Wen has been a researcher, as you know, on the Silk Road and on digital humanities studies, as far as I know. And he is also a prolific writer and has published extensively on major journals, both in the US and in China as well. And he's currently finishing up his book project entitled Agents of the Silk Road, Dunhuang Envoys and the Integration of Eastern Eurasia, and which is a social history of diplomatic travel on the Silk Road, written on the basis of Dunhuang documents. And today we are in for a very special treat because Professor Xin Wen has made a return from his many metaphorical and actual travels to the Silk Road outside the border. And he will be sharing with us his latest research today, entitled Capital of the Past, Urban and Cultural Transformations of Chang'an, 900 to 1400. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Wen. Xin.
Thank you very much, Huijun. I'd like to thank Professor Mai and Professor Berry for the introduction, and thanks to Esther for organizing the event. So like every speaker, my first line is, let me share my screen. All right, see, desktop. All right. You can see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, thank you everybody for coming tonight, or well, for me it's the evening. So tonight I am talking about a project that I started just a few years ago about the history of Chang'an. This is still very much at the beginning stage, so I'm really looking forward to your questions at the end. So just to briefly give you an overview, I think this audience know this history very well. In the Tang Dynasty, so I got these maps from the University of Washington website. in the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an was the capital, right? The story is kind of simple. In the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an was the capital. In the Song, it was not the capital anymore. The capital became Kaifeng. And in the northern Song, Chang'an was still a part of the Song, but then when the Qin emerged onto the the political landscape, Chang'an was ultimately conquered by the Qin and became part of the Jurchen Jin land. And then in the Yuan dynasty, Chang'an was still an important provincial level center. And then in the Ming, you have the same place, also a provincial center, now is known as Xi'an. So this is sort of roughly the history, the broadest outline of the history of Chang'an during this period. What I'm trying to work on in this project is not the history of Chang'an during the Tang, but the history of Chang'an after the Tang. More specifically, the history of Chang'an from the end of the Tang to the beginning of the Ming, so roughly 500 years. So to understand what happened in Chang'an after the fall of the Tang, we need to have a basic sense of what the city looked like during the Tang. So now I'll just give you a very brief introduction. So the Tang city of Chang'an is roughly a square. You have the imperial city. You can see my mouth, right? The imperial city, which housed the bureaucracy. All the governmental institutions are mostly housed in the imperial city, the Huangcheng. And then you have the palace city, which housed the palace. But then very early on, a new palace, the Daming Palace, was built in the northeast. And then later, a Xingqing Palace, this is in the Xuanzong's reign, another new palace was built here. And then along with the royal park, so these spaces are mostly what we can consider imperial spaces, the place where emperors were most active. And then the rest of the city are divided into these square units that we usually call ward or fang. These wards were walled up structures. They were not open, so they're curfews very often. So you kind of had to go back if you live in one of these wards before sunset. And then breaking the pattern of these wards are the two markets, Western market, Eastern market. And then one region, now here I sort of didn't translate it, it's called Qujiang. Somebody translated as serpentine pond. In the rest of the paper, I translated as twisting river, but it's not really a river, it's a pond. So maybe serpentine pond is a better translation. So within the space of this city lived about 1 million people. Right. So this is a very large city. And to give you a sense of how large it was, I've overlaid the map of Manhattan on top and with the same scale. So the city of Chang'an is about 1.5 or 1.6 the size of the island of Manhattan. So very large space. And this would have implications for what happened later. So of course, the city of Chang'an in the Tang is a topic that has long attracted scholarly attention. So I'm not going to have time to do a very detailed review, but just to give you a few highlights. There is a certain, well, the first group of these works that I'm laying out here really focus on Chang'an's history as a multicultural cosmopolis. Focusing on the life of foreigners, especially Central Asian people in the city of Chang'an. And then we have another group of more recent scholarship that considers Chang'an's role as the center of the Tang Empire, as the metropolis of the Tang. These are mostly published around 2000, and then a little bit more, even more recent than that, we have a group of sources, a group of works that deal with cultural life in Chang'an, especially the activities of literati and also examination candidates and their sort of cultural activity in Chang'an. So when we come back to the map of Chang'an, these groups of scholarship can actually be mapped onto different regions of the city. So they're not all talking about the city as a whole, because a work like Victor Xiong's work about the structure of the city, I would say the emphasis is on Chang'an as a metropolis, right? The Chang'an's different institutions that make up the palaces and the imperial city. Whereas Edward Schaeffer's book mostly focused on Chang'an as a cosmopolis, the different people from different cultural background that coexisted in Chang'an. And it just so happened that the Western market is the region where most of these foreigners lived. So around this region, you have a lot of Zoroastrian temples and Nestorian temples. And so when you map this book onto the city, it for the most part deal with the Western market and the surrounding area. And then the third group of scholarship, like Linda Feng's recent book, deals with the what I call cultural Chang'an, the activities of the literati and examination candidates. And the reason why these people mostly were active in this region was because they were active, they were living in the most expensive quarters, which are in the northeast. They were enjoying their life in red light district in the Pinkang ward, which is right next to the East Market. They were close to the imperial city, and they were especially for the examination candidates, they were, well, after they succeed, they would inscribe their name on the Xi'an Pagoda or the Great Goose Pagoda or Dayanta, and then they would also celebrate near the Twisting River or Qujiang. So in this sense, these different groups of works are also about different regions in Chang'an. But when we get to Chang'an after the Tang, there is a sudden and very precipitous drop in terms of the number of scholarship that we have. So I found these two books that are serious scholarship on Chang'an and on the region during this period. But as those of you who have read these books would know that they're really not about the city itself. They're about the region, either Shanxi or the Guangdong region. So the history of Chang'an in this 500 years really is a topic that is yet to be discussed seriously. So in order to do this, I will divide my talk into a few parts. The first part, I will talk about urban changes, what happened to the city itself after the fall of the Tang. And then the second part, I'll talk about what cultural exchanges that accompanied these urban exchanges. Third part, I'll give you a case study about a certain area of the city. And then finally, I'll try to highlight some of the things that I think are significant about this project. So urban changes. What exactly happened to the city of Chang'an after the fall of the Tang? The most important thing is downsizing. It just became smaller. Pretty simple story. Here is the city of Chang'an in the Tang. Here is the city in the Song. So the Song, well, this started in the 5 dynasties. Essentially, people at the time reused what was the old Tang imperial city, where the bureaucracy was, and used that as the new Song city. So this is one aspect. obviously, the changes involves a lot of very complicated things that we'll talk about, but the basic story is that it became much smaller, about 1/15 of the size of Tang Chang'an. But then in the Ming Dynasty, so in the Song and the Qin and the Yuan, the city stayed roughly like this. And then in the Ming Dynasty, expanded a bit to the east and to the north. And that essentially gave us the city that we have now. There are modifications, but the Qing city largely followed the structure of the Ming city. So this is roughly just the basic story of urban change that I'm talking about today. But as you can imagine, a downsizing doesn't just mean making everything smaller. It also causes structural instability in an urban space. What happened in the downsizing process is that certain offices had to be abandoned, such as the offices of the old 6 bureaus. Obviously, these are imperial level offices that were no longer useful for a new Chang'an as a center of a province. But new offices or new buildings were also built, such as the construction of the Cairo Monastery. Is roughly in this region of the city, because the old imperial city did not have any monasteries inside, because it's a space for the Tang bureaucracy. Whereas the new city obviously needed a Buddhist institution, or actually multiple Buddhist institutions, and the Cairo Monastery was built very early on in the new city. Certain things were moved from outside the city into the city. So the old Tang Imperial College, Guozijian, were moved into the Song city and became the provincial level college, provincial level school. Other things were moved out of the city. The old earth altar that was located in this region, in the Qin Dynasty, they were moved out into this ward, what eventually became this region, because obviously in a provincial city you don't need an earth altar where the emperor would perform the sacrifice. You also have, interestingly, lots of new discoveries in and around the city, because the basic fact with the process of that accompanied the process of downsizing is that a lot of these places that used to be walled up, populated regions of the old Chang'an, right, the palaces and the imperial spaces, now they were all just suburbs, farmland in many cases, because of the lifting up of the imperial structure. A lot of these places became places that people began to be able to access, and then new stuff, new fun, really interesting and strange things began to turn up. So here I'm just going to give you a selection of the things that I found that turned up in Chang'an after the fall of the Tang. So from Xu Yi Jianzhi, this is in the Qin Dynasty. You have the mirror of the consort Yang, right? Yang Guifei's mirror was discovered to the east, northeast of the city. You have Emperor Xuanzong's skull. Someone collected it, presumably from his tomb, but this would be very much to the northeast. You have pieces of stone, strange stones from the imperial park that once belonged to the emperor, that were made their way into the market and that were began to be collected. You have a box that supposedly held where the head of Han Xin, this Han Dynasty general, was stored, that was discovered in this period. And this is a story from Yi Jianzhi. The box was empty. You don't have the actual thing from inside here. So this is one process. The other process is that the empire also, not the empire, the city also became a bit more militarized, meaning that since the the Song city, the 5 dynasties, and the Song and the Qin city are now closer to the border, they have to build sort of fortification structures onto the city. So, these are very detailed. I'm not going to get into them now. But basically, you have the Song city, there are constructions happening in the Jin city. What's significant was that in the Yuan dynasty, in the Mongol period, another additional city was built to the northeast. This is where the Mongol prince stationed his court. And we have a very interesting record about these dual cities in the Yuan dynasty from Marco Polo, who talked about this city, right? Quanzhafu, which is a transliteration of Jingzhaofu, which was the name of Chang'an. This city was previously the capital of an extensive, noble, and powerful kingdom, obviously talking about Chang'an. But then this other place was on the plain about 5 miles from this city, where the King Mangalu, who was the 3rd son of Kublai, had his palace. So when we look at this and then compare this to and this place has been excavated. When we compare this to the Ming city, it's quite clear because in the Ming city, there's also a prince's court, and this part would eventually become the Manchu city in the Qing. That evidently, the reason to expand is almost like the Ming city absorbed the Yuan city from here into the city, and then that's the reason that it became bigger. Again, militarization, there is a lot to talk about. I'll just give you the outline. My focus, though, is what exactly happened to how people viewed the city as the city is becoming smaller and then becoming more militarized. And this is what I will talk about in the next section, which I'm sort of categorizing within the umbrella of cultural change. So again, this is the slide that I've shown you already. These strange things were being discovered in the new city because all these places that used to be guarded and very well secured places were now farmland and suburbs where people can go and dig things up. But these were not the only people who were doing the collecting, right? Collecting of, in many ways, in this case, literally the old remnants of the Tang Empire. There was these were not the only cases. There was in the late 11th century, a concerted effort by a group of very well connected literati scholars in collecting various remnants of the old city of Chang'an. And here I list a few of the key works that I see as being part of this collective effort. The earliest one is the Catalogue of Antiques, Jigulu by Ouyang Xiu. Second one is Gazetteer Chang'an by Song Minqiu. And then you have the maps of Chang'an made by Lü Dafang, the record of stone inscriptions by Tian Gai, Zhang Li's journey to the south of the city. It's a travelogue. And then Lü Dazhong's a collection of the forest of Stele or beilin collection, and then Lü Dalin's work on the antiquity as well. So obviously this is a lot. I'm not going to have time to get into every one of them. So I'll just talk about a few that I think are the most important, and then focus on one of these things, which is the forest of Stele collection or the beilin collection. One thing I want to point out now, though, is that these people all were roughly contemporaries, and they, for the most part, with the exception of Zhang Li, we don't know too much about him, and Tian Gai, these other people were in many ways connected. I mean, the most clear case is Lü Dafang, Lü Dazhong, and Lü Dalin were all they were brothers, right? There were the four Lüs of Lantian, along with Lü Dajun. They were local people from Chang'an region. They were from Lantian, just to the east of Chang'an. All right, so now let's look at a few examples. So here is very famous text, Jigulu, Catalog of Antiques by Ouyang Xiu. Here's a manuscript of Jigulu that is still extant. What I want to talk about is the origin of this collection. So how did Ouyang Xiu get to be able to collect all the things that he was able to collect? One of the most important origins is this other person named Liu Chang, also very important scholar and official at this time. Liu Chang was the head of the local government, which at that time is called Yongqingjun, right? He was ruling Chang'an at the time. And according to this note from Ouyang Xiu, Liu Chang was in Chang'an, in this region, because of the abandonment of the old city, from deserted foundations to disrupted tombs, much were found by farmers and herders, and Yuanfu, meaning Liu Chang, consistently purchased and collected. And these are the things that eventually became the beginning of Ouyang Xiu's collection. This is one example of collecting remnants of the old city of Chang'an. But of course, remnants don't only come in material forms. You also have textual remnants that were scattered after the end of an empire. And this is one example. This is the preface to, no, I think this is the tomb epitaph for Song Minqiu that talks about how he collected stuff when he composed the Gazetteer of Chang'an. So he says, remnant texts and bygone events are all dispersed into other accounts. Without one who is diligent and thoughtful, erudite and eloquent, meaning Song Minqiu, how can we hope to recover what has been lost and recover and write a complete book? So this effort to recover textual remnants of Chang'an is very much a goal of the Gazetteer. And here I'll give you one example to show you what I mean by that. On the left, so these are, as you can see, this is Yankangfang, this is Yankangfang. This is the same ward, right? The walled unit that I just talked about. This record is from Wei Shu's Liangjing Xinji, New Records of the Two Capitals from the 8th century. So in Wei Shu's record, he noted two places in the Yankang ward, the Ximing Monastery and the Jingfa Monastery. In Song Minqiu's record, however, he kept Wei Shu's account, but he noted that the Ximing Monastery used to be Yang Su. This is the Sui Dynasty, official Yang Su's house. This is one thing, right? But he also added all these different other informations. He also said that Yan Liben also had his house in this ward. There's a pavilion to the pond that belonged to Ma Lin, and then there were all these residences of different princes of the dynasty. So this is another example, right? The third example is that it's sort of another way around that. Now we only have fragments of this. This is the Chang'an map of Chang'an by Lü Dalin, and now we don't have the whole map. We only have certain fragments, and these are the rubbings made of the fragments that are still extant. And here is what it looks like when we place it back onto a map of Chang'an. So the fragments mostly cover the north of the city and then the southern suburbs. But if you look closely on these maps, what it's doing is very similar to what Song Minqiu is doing. He's trying to add information within the space of a ward, and in that way, I think also collecting remnants of the old city. But the most clear, or the clearest example of this activity, this kind of activity, comes from the Beilin Museum. So this is what it looks like. Many of you might have been there. Forest of Stele, right? A forest of inscriptions. they just celebrated in 2017 their 930th anniversary, which means they traced their history to the year 1087. So why is that? In fact, the collection of the beilin, the sort of start of the beilin collection, you can trace it to an even earlier period. So here is an image of one of the most famous steles in Chinese history, right? For anyone who does calligraphy, this is something that you would try to copy and sort of imitate. The Yan family shrine stele, the Yan Shi Jia Miao Bei. I want to, this obviously was, this was made by the famous Yan Zhenqing and date to 780. And here is there's a rubbing that was sort of put on top of the stele, but I want to draw your attention not to the stele, the writing of the stele itself, but to the small writing here. And I'll zoom in to show what I mean. So here is the small colophon or inscription that's written in the 10th century. And here, in part, it says that the writing of Yan Zhenqing and the Yang Bing, both famous calligraphers, are really exceptionally precious, and we need to and people treasure them as if they're pearl and jade. But ever since the disorder of the Tang house, this inscription fell in the dirt and dust of the suburban and rural areas, and it was the job of this person and their fellow men who then recollected this inscription and brought them back into the Song city. So I'm going to show you what this process looked like on the map, because this stele was for the shrine of Yan Zhenqing, and we know it was in the Tonghua ward. So the stele should still be here in the late Tang and early 10th century and in the early Song as well. This, if we know the geography of the city in the Tang, you would know that this is one of the most prime locations. Many famous literati lived in Tonghua ward. But in the Song, this became a land of suburban and rural area where an important stele would fall into dirt. So what these people did was that they moved this this inscription back into the city, and that essentially became the beginning of the beilin collection. So I was able to put a number of stones that we know that were already in the beilin collection in the northern Song and put them back to where they used to be during the Tang, and see how this process played out, because this was not the only one that underwent such a process of relocation. And here are some of the most important ones. I'm not going to talk about them one by one, but these were all brought back into the Song city in the Song Dynasty by the time of the late 11th century. So you can see that the collection effort really centered around the north of the city. Very few stuff are collected from the south of the city, which makes sense because it was a very large city, and it would take a lot of effort to move a large piece of stone from very far away. We know these collection activities very well because of one stone inscription that is now in the beilin collection. It's a record of the newly moved stone classics in the Jingzhaofu, in Chang'an. And just to give you a taste of what it talks about, it explains the kind of thing that were collected, right? That includes the stone classics of the Kaicheng Ring. This is the largest. If you go to beilin now, in the first room, is filled with these the complete set of stone classics, right? Another important one is the stele of the classic of filial piety that was the commentary by Emperor Xuanzong, and then all these writings by the famous calligraphers, And importantly, at the end, the text says, this collection indeed is the grand spectacle from the old capital. And here you see the image of the old capital emerging. So to show you how this collection continued to matter, right? It was assembled in the Song, but continuously in the Qin and in the Yuan and the Ming, people continue to engage with this collection. I want to show you, I want to just tell you a little story about one of the most important stone in this collection, the classic of filial piety, Shitai Xiaojing, that was carved in 745, that was moved from the imperial college back into the Song city in the Song Dynasty. So unlike, if you look at these stones, these are just basically one piece of stone, one narrow piece of stone. Most steles look like that. This one doesn't look like that. This one is a square. It was made of 4 pieces of stone because you need enough space to write the entire Xiaojing and the commentary. But that means that there is a hole in the middle. And during the reparation process in 1973, they opened it and realized that there were actually stuff in the middle. It's not just there was a hole, there were people adding stuff in the middle. And this is kind of the structure of that stele. So you can see here, you would have an empty space. So what did they find in this hole in the stone, in the piece of stone? There are Jurchen word list. This is the manuscript of Jurchen word list. There's a piece of block printed painting. But for our purposes, the most important one, and perhaps is a very small piece. And here is, so this on the very right side, this piece is found in the inside that stele. And you can see that this piece is a rubbing of this line from the Yan family shrine inscription. So think about this. What this implies was that because the Yan family shrine and the stone classics and the filial piety stone, they were in the same collection at this time. So this collection, because of the presence of Jurchen inscription and also coins that date to the Song and the Qin period, we know that the stuff that were stuffed into the inscription, they were put there in the Qin Dynasty, right? So at that time, you can imagine that this is a later map, but you can sort of imagine these stones were closely located closely together. This is where in the late Qing, the Yan Shijia Miaobei was, the Yan family shrine was here, and then the filial piety stone is here. So you can imagine in the Qin Dynasty, people made rubbings of this inscription and for some reason just stuffed it in the stone stele. I'm not going to talk about this anymore, but Gu Yanwu also talks about the continued collection of the stones. And then in the Qing Dynasty, we have the gazetteer, and as you can see, stated very clearly in the Confucian College Temple of Confucius, you have the beilin painted here. So to kind of summarize what I've talked about in this part, you have right the stone inscription that talks about the collection of these stones, talking about making reference to the old capital, right? You have, and this is a Qin Dynasty tomb epitaph of a commoner in Chang'an that talks about the fact that Chang'an was the old capital of the Zhou and Qin dynasties, and every household possessed some objects that were worthy of enjoyment and connoisseurship. Another example, if you look at a Yuan dynasty gazetteer, Chang'an, Luo Tianxiang also talks about Chang'an being the capital since the Zhou, Qin, Han, Jin, Western Wei, later Zhou dynasties. And then finally, you had the record of Marco Polo. So obviously, the image of Chang'an being the old capital dominated the cultural life and the cultural reproduction in the city at this during this period of time. But this is perhaps not surprising, right? Chang'an has been the capital for as long as anyone could remember. Now it's not capital anymore. So the fact that people seem to remember and talk about and act on the fact that it was the old capital was probably not very surprising. What is surprising, though, I would argue, is exactly what part of the old Chang'an did people appreciate? What aspect of the past of this capital did people in the Song through the early Ming focus on? And that is what I will talk about in this next section. And I'll start with a trip to the south of Chang'an. This is written in a travelogue by Zhang Li in 1084. It's very substantial text. I'm just going to talk about a few of the things that he did as he started the journey. So here he started from inside the city, and then he left the city itself, and then he passed these two wards that used to be Tang wards, and then he says these two wards still had long markets, but the rest of the area was basically farming field. So confirming what we talked about with regard to the Yan family shrine stele. And then he kept going further south. He observed the little Goose Pagoda, seeing that this is the Jianfu Monastery Pagoda. It was still there. He then continued to travel to the Great Goose Pagoda. What is not known as Great Goose Pagoda is this is the Xi'an Monastery Pagoda, and viewed colophons by Tang people, right? So the journey to this place is very much connected to the activity of reviewing and recovering Tang literary legacy. And then he ascended the pagoda. It's supposedly still that's still something that you could do at this time. And then he looked at the area of twisting rivers. He said, on the pagoda, we observed the palaces and gardens of the twisting river, a place of past pleasure and amusement. Now they are merely wild weeds. These pleasure and amusement obviously belonged to the successful examinees who passed the Jinshi exams. So I took a photo when I climbed onto the on top of the monastery, and this is looking at the region now that Zhang Li looked at. Now you can see in the distance there's a pond, right? The pond was restored, so now you can almost still see the pond that people saw in the Tang. So the what Zhang Li saw was an intervening dry area of this region, a dry era of this region, if you will. And here is the another image. You can see Qujiang, the twisting river, and this is the Xi'an monastery. So what does this trip tell us then? If we put it back to this, very, very messy map, I'm sorry for that. What is clear is that Zhang Li's interest was not Zhang Li was not interested in visiting the palaces and the imperial park, right? So Zhang Li's interest is different from Victor Xiong. Zhang Li also didn't go to the west of the city, didn't visit the Western market, didn't try to seek out the remnants of these old Central Asian sites of Central Asian people. So his interest was also different from that of Edward Schaeffer. What he did almost very perfectly maps onto what scholars like Linda Feng talks about with regard to the literary culture, the activities of the Jinshi examinees and who were active in the southeastern part of the city. And Zhang Li's case was not exceptional. In fact, we have a lot more examples to show that really this area was during the Song through the Yuan and Ming dynasties, the area that most people lived outside of the city, that is, and that most people were interested in. I'll just very quickly give you a few examples. This is a Yuan dynasty stone inscription, also no, Qin dynasty, sorry, stone inscription that is now in the beilin collection. I'm just going to read the first two lines. It talked about the old foundations remain as they mention. This is the famous, mention of the mutual illumination of the flower petals and sepals, the Huae Xianghui. And this mention has already collapsed, right? We only have old foundations, but visitors can still read the stele that were spared by the fire. So where are they doing it? This is in the Xingqing Palace that eventually turned into the Dragon Pond. It was known as the Dragon Pond or Longchi at this time. And so people were going there. And this is also a place where a lot of the, if you look at the Tang, Tang poets, many people have written poems when they were attending a banquet in the Xingqing Palace. So this area was also of great interest. In fact, we have a record from the Yuan Dynasty gazetteer that talks about this particular guy, Zhang Jinzi, constructing a new structure near in this region that became a new touristy attraction that people on the third month, right, Shangci, and the ninth month, Chongjiu, would go there and celebrate. So here, obviously, you can see that people were going to the east of the city when they have to travel outside the city. You also have other examples. This is a Qin Dynasty inscription. On the back side, you have the list of the people who engaged in some form of imitation of the Yanta, the Goose Pagoda celebration of the Tang literati, Tang examination takers. And going back to Zhang Li's record, he talks about how the gentlemen and commoners of Chang'an every spring would swarm the road to visit the Xi'an, the Great Goose Pagoda. So what we have here is that you have the city, right? But it's what seems to interest people after the fall of the Tang outside the city seems to have clustered in the east and south of the city, the southeastern region of the city. And these are not the only examples. In fact, when we look at how people talk about the city in this era, we see many more examples that proves this point. So I'll just give you a selection of different genres of text, right? Wen Yanbo's poem talks about his journey to the south of the city, and you can see the twisting river, apricot garden, the Xingyuan also in the region. In Yuan Dynasty gazetteers, Luo Tianxiang also talks about, if I travel far, I will go to Fanchuan, Duqu, and Weiqu. So these are all places, these are the villas that the Tang literati had outside the Tang city. So outside the map that I'm showing you, but in the south. But if I travel closer to the city, I'll go to the Goose Pagoda and the Dragon Pond, the two places that I just talked about. In the Ming Dynasty, we have another journey travelogue to the south of the city, same title, essentially replicating Zhang Li's journey, and therefore covering pretty much the same sites. The result of this overwhelming interest is that by the Qing, by the time we have these sort of almost lists of the hit sites of a place like Chang'an Shijing, right? 12 scenes of Chang'an, 8 scenes of Guanzhong. If we look at what was included in the Chang'an Shijing, in the 12 scenes, among the 9 scenes that were near the city of Chang'an itself, there's some that were really far away. 8 of them are located in the south and southeast of the city. Among the 8 scenes of Guanzhong, there are 2 scenes that are close to Chang'an, the Twisting River, and the Goose Pagoda, again, both in this region. So this is sort of the conclusion that I'm drawing. This is the most populous and culturally most vibrant region of the city in this period. What does this mean, right? This is what the literatis were doing. You know, you might ask, who cares? Maybe what they do really have no impact on urban structure anyway. But remember, I talked about how the city of the Ming expanded to the east and the north. We can understand why there was the need to expand, because it has to house the court of the Ming prince. But the direction of expansion hasn't really been talked about too much. And I will argue that the interest in this region of the city has everything to do with how the city would continue to expand. And here's what I mean. In the Tang Dynasty, going back to the Tang a little bit, the imperial palace had 3 southern gates. Very early on, the Zhuque gate, the main gate, was closed, right, in the early 10th century, because the Zhuque gate connects to the Zhuque Boulevard. It's about 100 meters wide, clearly too much for a provincial city. So that was closed down. A key moment for the history of the urban change in Chang'an came in the Yuan dynasty, when the Hanguang gate was also closed. So obviously, I mean, at least as you know, my interpretation is that as the Yuan palace of the prince moved here, the administration of the city, you know, you probably don't have as many personnel. So they made the decision to close one city on the southern wall, and they made the decision to close this one. In fact, the Hanguang Gate has been excavated, and people see the traces of filling from the Yuan dynasty that presumably was part of that effort. So why did they choose to close this city and not this one, this gate and not this one, right? Not Anshan Gate. I would argue that if you imagine the cultural landscape, then this is the most culturally populous, vibrant and most populous region, and all these residents and travelers talks about constantly how they go out of the city and visit these sites. In this context, it's not hard to understand why, if they were to close one city, they would decide to close this one and not this one, because otherwise people had to travel all the way through the Hanguang city to these sites. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And this decision becomes important because what the Ming dynasty, what happened in the Ming city is that, well, I'll show you the map here, right? This is the map of the city in the Yuan dynasty. After the closure of the city, obviously, what you can see here is that the road in the city was not symmetrical anymore. The southern city is slanted, right? It's to the east. So what happened in the Ming was that the city expanded again to recenter the Anshan Gate. So now the Anshan Gate is again in the center axis of the city. So this is, I would argue, a way in which the appreciation of these sites became important, because they apparently did have an impact on how the city actually looked like. And another example why this interest in the southeast of the city was important is that these 2 pagodas, the Little Goose Pagoda, the Great Goose Pagoda, where all these people continue to travel, continue to write about, and continue to also repair, are the only 2 places that are still standing, that are above ground structure in the city that we can date to the Tang. All the other famous stupas and monasteries, they were all they're all gone. So why do we only have these 2 places? I would argue it also had everything to do with the overwhelming interest in this region from the Song through the Ming. So finally, I want to talk a bit about why I think these stories matter, right? This is talking about Chang'an after the Tang. Who cares about what happened to the city? It's not the capital anymore. I would argue that it is important because there are a number of things, a number of lessons that it can teach us. The first lesson is that going back to the list of works about the collecting of Chang'an, remnants of Chang'an, these works were very often the first of the kind, first work in that genre that we have. Maybe it's not the first, but very often it's the first one that we have, right? Scholars of the Song very familiar with this, these first very early antique catalogs. Chang'an, a gazetteer of Chang'an is also the earliest extant gazetteer we have. First earliest city map that's carved on a piece of stone, possibly the first museum in the Beilin collection, and then the first locally based collection. And this is I need to do a bit more research. So what I'm seeing here is that the loss of the status of the capital and the fundamentally disrupting effect that had in Chang'an had the further impact of motivating people to write and think about city and about the past in very new ways. And these are the innovations that this process inspired. Another thing, this is a very simple point. This change persisted through the 5 dynasties, the Northern Song, the Qin, the Yuan, and the Ming. These dynasties, in other different ways, we will see them as being very different. But in this way, they seem to have been quite consistent. So is there a lesson there for us to think about? Another lesson is that most scholarship on this in this period, right, in the from the middle period to the late imperial period, in the field of Chinese urban history, focus on the more prosperous, more populated south. Most of the works, there are obviously exceptions that we have, are about the southern cities like Yangzhou, Hangzhou, Suzhou, Shanghai, and Wuchang, and so on. So by providing a study of the city in the north, hopefully we will have a more complete picture of the urban history of China in this period. And then finally, the last point, I know I talked a bit too long. I think this experience of the Song, Yuan, and Ming people sort of appreciating the city, the southeast part of the city, more than any other part of the city, would be put in a very sharp light if we compare it to how people now view the city. And here I present you the Imperial City Renaissance project that started in the city of Xi'an from 2005. If you go now, there are new buildings, new constructions on the Tang sites that you can see in many places. They built a statue of celebrating the height of the Kaiyuan, right, with these images that signified foreign presence, right? The idea of the cultural diversity of the city, which is even clearer in this statue that depicts travelers on the Silk Road that was strategically placed near the Kaiyuan Gate, which is the northwestern gate of the city, obviously that connects to the Silk Road. You also have the reconstruction of the front gate of the Daming Palace. This is the Zhuque. No, this is not the Zhuque. This is the Zhuque Gate. This is the Danfeng Gate. And then you have the very fantastical reconstruction of, I don't even know which part of this was supposed to replicate, but part of the west market of the Tang. So it's quite clear from this image that as much as places like Qujiang was still celebrated, the current government of Chang'an, of Xi'an, and the resident of Xi'an, and really people in China now are very interested in celebrating the history of the city, and in particular the imperial aspect of its history and the multicultural aspect of its history. And this posed a very a clear contrast to how the Song people view the city. So now I have the final quote for this talk. This is from the preface to Chang'an Zhi, right? So this is Zhao Yanruo looking at the same place, looking at the ruins of the Danfeng, not the Danfeng Gate. Modern Xi'an government decided to rebuild it like this, very magnificent structure. How did the Song people feel about it? Well, how did this Song person feel about it? He said that if we look at these sites, they're indeed very grand. But if we examine the Zhou dynasty sites, they were uniquely simple, right? They uniquely honor simplicity and frugality, and never boasts about the strategic significance and economic prosperity. And here is the striking word. The traces like the Tang, of the Han and the Tang, like the Danfeng Gate, are thus feel really shameful. Where is the glory in celebrating places like that? Obviously, this is not how people feel now. So to conclude, what I've talked about is that after the fall of the Tang, the city of Chang'an became smaller and more militarized. And at the same time, there was an intense interest in Chang'an's past that were manifested in various acts of collecting, resulting in the creation of an image of Chang'an as the capital of the past. But people at this time were not interested in all aspects of the old capital. In particular, they were interested in the cultural sites in the southeastern suburbs of the city, which represented a tacit rejection of the sites that signified imperial power and cosmopolitanism in the north and the west of the city. And then finally, this way of approaching the capital of the past seems to have persisted through the Yuan and through dynasties such as Song and Qin and the Yuan and the Ming. But it poses a stark contrast to how contemporary urban planners and residents of Xi'an and of China saw its past. Thank you very much. This is a friend that I found when I was doing research in the Beilin Museum 2 years ago. I'm really looking forward to going back soon, and I also look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Wenxing. And I hope you could meet your cat friend soon as well. And thank you. I feel so privileged to be in the audience and hear the newest thoughts and directions that you're taking the project to. And I'm very happy to be part of the conversation. And so before I read out the first question that we already have on the Q&A panel, if you have questions, comments, please paste it on, copy it and paste it on the Q&A panel so that we'll read it out and then Wenxing could answer it in the following session. Mm-hmm. So I have, the first question I have coming from Daniel Borengasser, and I apologize if I mispronounce any of your names, please correct me. But from Daniel, fascinating talk. I'm curious if you can say a little more about policies regarding the locations of Buddhist temples in and around the town city, and how policies may have changed over time, or how the relocation of the capital affected the development, expansions, contractions, or relocations of major religious institutions.
Mm-hmm. Just one thing I just wanted to mention is that I think there are questions in the chat box too. So people are doing things in both places. Thank you for the question. So I give you one example of the establishment of the Kaiyuan Monastery within the city. In fact, we know about this we know about this from the Song record, but we also know about this because there is a stele that was made for the construction of the monastery that were copied and either copied in Dunhuang or copied in Chang'an, and then sort of moved to Dunhuang. But in Dunhuang, we actually have a document about this process. But broadly speaking, yes, it's mostly just contraction, right? If you think about how many monasteries were there in Chang'an, even after the Huichang persecution, obviously there were wide-scale persecution. A lot of the monasteries were ordered to be closed. But after that, very quickly, there was a revival, and there were still a substantial number of inscriptions of monasteries. In fact, some of the inscriptions that I've shown you in the slide were collected from these monasteries. Maybe I can sort of share the screen again just to show you what I mean, right? So here, these stele, the Duobao Ta Bei and then the Chujin Chanshi Bei. So these were likely collected from the monastery, right? So was this these sort of Buddhist steles. So what that means is that these monasteries themselves were probably not operating anymore. Again, we had to think about how big the space was. It's very far. If most people were living in the city, there's no reason to have monasteries outside. So most of these monasteries were abandoned. But then the ones that I talked about that accompanied the Great Goose Pagoda, right? The Xi'an and then the Small Goose Pagoda, they were kept. And then one final point is that new monasteries were built in the city. In the Song, we know from various sources there are probably 4 or 5 new monasteries that were built, and some of them, the Kaiyuan Si, there's a later text that falsely claimed that the Kaiyuan Si traces history back to the Tang. It really doesn't. These new monasteries have very little to do with the old Tang monasteries. Yeah, there are a lot to talk about. I want to keep the answers like relatively short.
Yes, thank you. We do have a lot of questions coming up. So our second question here from the chat box from Professor Min Li, one of our colleagues here at UCLA. He asked, the most walls palace foundations of the Western Han Chang'an were still visible on the northwestern corner of the Tang Chang'an. And any Song Yuan Ming antiquarian interest on the ruins of Han royal city?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm actually, this is an interesting story that I always like to bring up. The relationship between these cities. Again, I think I will show a map to kind of explain what that means. Share screen again. So here, this is what I have a few additional slides. This is what the city looks like, right? The structure, right? I talked mostly about the Tang city. Of course, the Han Dynasty Chang'an is just to the northwest. In the Tang, it was like you've said, in the Tang, it was still visible. In fact, it was because it was sort of enclosed within the Tang Imperial Park. There were actually new constructions. The Weiyang Palace was rebuilt in the Tang for a little bit. So the Tang Emperor would go see them. But of course, this region was not open to other people. Right? Normal residents would not be able to visit the Han city. What happened in the Song is clearly that things that once were buried in the Han city were coming out. Why do you have a box that supposedly has the head of Han Xin? So the Han structure, because of the removal of the Tang structure, was in a way reactivated. And this is a very interesting story that I'm super fascinated by it. I was just talking about a story this afternoon with in my class. We're talking about ghost stories in Chang'an, and one of the ghost stories is, so because the Han city is here, you can't bury the dead within the city. You had to bury the dead around the city. So some of the Han dead Han people were buried in what eventually became the Tang city, which means the Tang houses were sometimes built on Han graves. So there's this ghost story about the famous early Han General Fan Kuai, who someone built a toilet on top of Fan Kuai's grave, and Fan Kuai was not very unhappy, so he came out and just haunted that house and then killed a lot of people and asked the person to remove his grave, relocate his grave somewhere else. So you would imagine that things like that were suppressed, once suppressed by the Tang structure, once it's removed, would become alive again. All right, stop sharing this.
Fascinating. Thank you. And the next question coming from Yunshuang Zhang. For the dynasties after the Tang, the past of Chang'an was not only as a Tang capital, but also as the memory of Zhou, Qin, Han, etc. So did people after the Tang select different aspects from this earlier dynasties?
Yes, the answer, and thank you very much, Yunshuang, for the question. I don't know if I have a map for it here. I don't, but obviously, if you look at the Chang'an Zhi, for instance, it has a long section on the Han city. So Song Minqiu was collecting the history of the entire region, not just the history of it as the Tang capital. But I would say the most striking example comes from this text called Yonglu, by a Southern Song person called Cheng Dachang. I have to dig a bit deeper to see, but I think he's never been to Chang'an, because at that time Chang'an was already part of the Qin state. So he wrote this text that had this, I wish I had the map here, but he basically put Qin Dynasty, Han Dynasty, Zhou Dynasty, Sui Dynasty, and Tang Dynasty structures on the same map, and called this process called Wu Dai Du Yong, 5 dynasties having their capital in the Yong region. In that way, it sort of presents this very interesting palimpsest of imperial existence in the same space. So yes, there are other examples, other ways of viewing the past of the region, and so I'm just focusing on the Tang part now. But thank you very much.
So the next question coming from Qingfeng Nie. He said, you mentioned the continuity from the Song to the Ming. Could you elaborate? So this is connected to what you just said about the temporal scheme of your project.
Right. I mean, so I'm really getting to the early Ming. I think, I'm not a late imperial scholar. I kind of shudder a little bit at the thought of having to read Ming stuff. I have started reading some the Jiajing Shanxi gazetteer, but what I'm saying really, I'm talking about the period from the 5 dynasties to the early Ming, and the continuity I see is that there wasn't as if there's a sudden turn as there is now of the interest to go rebuild the old palaces, right? Let's try to write about the existence of these Nestorian churches. What they seem to have been consistently interested was the region where the Jinshi examinees were most active. And here you can see it, I would say most clearly in the continued addition and inscriptions on the different stones in beilin. So one of the most interesting aspects of this research is that I want to explore beilin as an archive, because I don't know, I think many of you probably have been to beilin. The way that beilin is presented, the Stele museum is presented, is that it's a collection of Tang Dynasty stones. You go there to see the Yan family shrines in Stele. You go there to see the Nestorian Christian Stele, all Tang, and the stone classics, right? But on the edge, on the backside, and as I've said, on the corners of these stones, you have later traces of Song, Qin, Yuan, and Ming inscriptions that showed continued interest in this side, but also in the broader southeast of the city. So that's what I meant by the continuity.
Thank you. Next question from Di Wang. Thank you, Professor Wan. Very fascinating talk. As we know, the Tang literati in Chang'an also wrote various pieces about their nostalgic feeling towards the Han Dynasty Chang'an, like the poem about Le Youyuan. Right. How would you compare this nostalgia with Song, Jin, Yuan people's appreciation of the Tang city of Chang'an?
That's a really good question. I would say, again, the Song Jin Yuan nostalgia for Tang Chang'an was centered around not only geographically this region, right? It's not as if they're writing about how Xuanzong would have thought about a certain place. They're writing about how Bai Juyi would have seen, what Du Fu would have seen. But they're also temporally clustered around the mid to late Tang region periods when the examination became the most prominent. So you also don't see as much celebration of the early Tang. So there seems to be a clear differentiation. But also another thing is just the scale. I'm very interested, I mean, DU was in one of my classes a couple of years ago, so we talked about this issue. I'm very interested in how the Tang city, how people in the Tang looked at the Han sites that's either outside or in the Tang city. But the scale of this sort of reflection and recollection seems to have been much smaller. There are examples of Tang people talking about the Han sites, but they're not a lot. That was not the overwhelming interest that they had. So I think that's also another difference. But yes, this is a great question. I need to think more about it.
Thank you. So next question coming from Julia Orel. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I never realized that the Northern Song antiquarian collecting was so focused around Chang'an. Did the downsizing of the city enable that process because what was city had turned into fields and thus open up to discoveries?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I don't want to overemphasize this point, right? I don't want to make this point too strongly, because if you look at Jigulu, there were a lot of the things that Ouyangxiu collected. They're from all over the place. And the same goes with the Kaogutu, so Lü Daling. But what I think the role of Chang'an is important in this story, because in Ouyangxiu's case, the first group of ancient objects that he collected were from Liu Chang, who collected them from Chang'an. So you can, in a way, you can say this inspired him to do this, right? And one of the things that I started doing is to kind of calculate what's the percentage of the things from Chang'an that made their way into Ouyangxiu's collection. It's, I would say, tentatively a good, 20%. And comparing to the entire, if you think about Chang'an's place in the entire Song Empire, that's a pretty good representation. So I would say yes, but with some conditioning.
The next question from Yukina Zhang, and this is actually related to what we once talked about before. So the question is about the authors and collectors seem to consist primarily of people who might have identified more with the literati past. And I was wondering if there might have been an active selection of material and knowledge behind the strong interest in sites and monuments in the south and southeast part of the city. And would there have been a hierarchy of curiosity toward and collection of the past?
Yes, there seems to be a hierarchy in the sense that most of the elites were interested in the southeast, but that doesn't mean that there weren't any other examples, right? This person, I think, I talked to Hui Jun about him. This guy called Liu Shixiong, Northern Song general, mostly a military guy, who nonetheless is, quite good at writing, is a clear exception. He was very active in the region, but what he did was not to inscribe his name in places like Qujiang, like the Twisting River, or the Xi'an Pagoda. He created all these like different shrines for Emperor Taizong. Well, he didn't create them. The Song government created some of them, but he created a stele for the grave, for the mausoleum for Taizong and for the Taizong of Tang, and then a stele of the six horses, the famous six horses. In fact, according to that stele, it seems that he replicated, he reproduced the six horses and placed it in the court of the Lichuan County, because the actual horses were very far on top of the mausoleum. It's hard to get to. And then he visited a lot of other a lot of other imperial sites. So there are people like that, but that's very much an exception. So one thing that I would want to do to expand on this a little bit is so I've been looking at the Song and Qin Dynasty inscriptions in beilin. Another thing to do is to look at these inscriptions on other Tang Dynasty stones in the mausoleum, right? A very famous, very well studied example is the is a Qin Dynasty by an inscription in Khitan, written on the backside of Wu Zetian's stele. So Wu Zetian's stele famously is empty. So there was a lot of space to carve stuff. There were a lot of later carvings. The most famous one is this one, but there were a lot of other ones. So there were people who were interested in these places. It's just they were not necessarily the cultural elites as these Song, the most famous people like Su Shi. Su Shi also talked about this in some of his poems, like Ouyang Xiu.
Thank you. So it looks like the literary group win over the military group in this contest of claiming Chang'an. And so our next question coming from Wanmeng Li, one of our PhD students here. And she said, I'm really intrigued by your discussion of people's concern of southeastern part of the original Chang'an city, especially you mentioned the case of the two pagodas and their preservations. And this reminded me of James Flatt's book on the Kong Temple. For Flatt, the negotiation of power among the Kong family, the local officials, and the central government consistently shaped the form of Kong Temple. And I'm wondering how different social forces involve in the preservation of the cultural quarter in the southeastern part of the city.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the reference. I have not read that book. It sounds like a very interesting read. I'll go seek it out. What I see, and here is, so we have very good information about this from Zhang Li's travelogue. So the travelogue that I just talked about, the travelogue to the south of the city. So he visited these pagodas, and then he talks about the condition of the pagoda. in the late 11th century, right? And then to his text, there was a anonymous addition of further notes written by a late Qin Dynasty person that talks about what these sites looked like in the Qin Dynasty. And then you have the Yuan Dynasty gazetteer by Luo Qianxiang that also talks about how these sites were like. And then obviously you have the Ming Dynasty gazetteers, then travelogues. So you kind of know what happened to these places. I mean, very often the construction and rebuilding of these structures would need communal support. It's not just the effort of the government. The government obviously had to take the lead and often did, but there were communal engagement with these sites. And importantly, especially when you get to the Ming, many people might know there were a lot of earthquake that really had some severe impact on these sites. So they were constantly rebuilt and at least repaired and maintained. I've seen data about that in the Song through the Yuan dynasties. I would need to look a bit further down in the Ming and the Qing, but that seems to have been what was going on.
Thank you. I noticed that we are actually approaching 5:30, but we do have a few more questions here.
I can go a few longer. I can go a few longer if you want.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you for the audience who stay over. We still actually have a large audience listening up. So our next question from Ting Chi Wu. Thank you, Professor Wan, a very inspiring talk. I'm wondering why you choose to stop the research period in 1400. Do people in the Ming and Qing period stop collecting the Tang remains or stop recollecting the Tang legacies?
The short answer is no, but I don't know as well. And the reason I stopped there is partially just my limit as a medievalist or middle period scholar. I'm a little bit nervous in going into the Ming. Too deep into the Ming, and definitely don't want to go into the Qing. It's a scary place. But there is there are some intellectual rationale for it, and I think a major one is the what the city looked like, right? If you zoom out, we know very much about the Tang city. We know very well about the Tang city. We know quite a bit about the Ming city because the current, the Qing and then the modern city, they were like basically built on the basis of the Ming city. So they're roughly similar. And socially, therefore, they also perhaps have similar impacts on the population. It is this intervening 5 centuries that we don't have a very clear idea of. So in order to not make this project too big to handle, I want to sort of focus on these 5 centuries. I mean, 5 centuries is a long time. I talked to my colleagues in the history department. They're like, this is too big, but your question is well taken. I need to, even if I don't plan to go into that, I need to at least have a better sense of what was going on.
Indeed, and excuse me for interjecting a little bit. So could you care to say a bit more about the beginning point, 900? Because what you mentioned about the material sources are mostly from 11th century, right? And so is the beginning point having more to do with the militarization or the downsizing before the beginning of Song?
Great question. It has a lot to do, I would say, with both. The reason that I start with 900 is that I think I can defend a little bit better. The Tang capital was moved out of Chang'an. The Tang emperor was forced out of Chang'an in 904. So I just rounded up to 900. And along that process, this is Zhu Quanzhong or Zhu Wen, depending on your perspective. He not only forced the emperor out of Chang'an, he also forced a large population of the city, and then took down a lot of the building materials because he wants to rebuild Luoyang with these people and the building structures. So he moved everything to Luoyang. And around the same time, maybe at the same time, or maybe just a few years later, a local warlord named Han Jian started constructing the new city, because the new city is not just that they didn't just use the old Tang city, Tang imperial city as the new city. It still needed more construction, right? So the construction also happened in the first decade of the 10th century, and that would include, because the thing with the imperial city in the Tang is that it doesn't have a northern wall, because in the north it connects to the palace, so you don't need to defend against the emperor, right? I mean, you would think the palace had a southern wall, so there was one wall, but the imperial city didn't have a northern wall, so they had to connect the city to the palace and use part of the palace city. So it still needed construction, and in that process, you can say that that's the militarization. But both processes already started in the early 10th century, and that's why I started there.
Thank you. And actually, this gives us a nice transition to our next question from Grace Tan. And her question is about what you have talked about seems to be largely cultural interest of literati in the south and east part of Chang'an. But how did this interest result in a shift of urban expansion direction after Song? Or was it just coincident with the shift? I would like to know if any other factors contributed to the shift of urban expansion.
So this is sort of the more conjectural part of the talk, right? My suspicion is that if you have to close one gate, you probably close the gate that's facing an area that people are not very interested in going, as opposed to closing the gate that people regularly would use. The way to kind of substantiate this, to kind of try to substantiate this claim, is to actually look at the situation inside the city. So one thing that you would notice that I haven't really talked too much about is that I didn't really talk a lot about what was going on inside the city, inside the Song and the Yuan and the Qin and Yuan city. That does it's not because we don't have the sources. I just haven't done the work yet. I'll just show you one very good source that I am in the process of making use, and this is a so can you see?
Yes.
You can see this piece of stone, right? You can see how small the inscriptions are.
Right.
This is a list of the pieces of land that was given to support the provincial college, a provincial school in the Qin Dynasty. So each entry lists someone's house and the borders of the house. So what I'm doing is that I'm using these to kind of try to reconstruct what was going on in the Qin city. With this kind of work, my hope is that you get a bit of the a bit more. You get to know a bit more about the more social aspect of the change, and with that potentially, I'll be able to either substantiate or refute my my current hypotheses about why the city moved to the east. But as of now, this is largely just my hypotheses. I think it makes sense, but nonetheless, it's a hypothesis.
Thank you. So our next question coming from Professor Sonia Li, who teaches art history, also in our neighboring institution. So your interpretation of post-Tang Chang'an seems to be based mostly on transmitted text. What about archaeological materials that surfaced in recent years? Do they corroborate with the information in these texts, or do they paint a very different picture?
I guess the answer is yes, because I feel like the thing on the stones in beilin, they're textural, but they're also, you can say that they're material, right? They're not just textual. But recent archaeological discoveries, you would know that around Xi'an, there are a lot of new discoveries. And these things are obviously very, very important. And one of the things that I would, but most of them are from the Tang Dynasty. So they're kind of not really relevant for what I'm doing. Two things immediately comes to mind when I think about this question. One is that I was reading a Song Dynasty epitaph that was discovered in the southern part of the city, that had it been in the Tang, would have been within the city. So in the Tang, there would be no one would be allowed to bury anyone, and therefore there wouldn't be any epitaph. So when you discover the Song epitaph in that region, and it talks about it was buried in their family graveyard, so it gives you a sense of how that region was used in the Song. So hopefully I can collect more materials that give me a better sense of how that area developed. So that's one. Another one is a big discovery that everyone in Northern Song studies know about, which is the Lü family graveyard, right? I talked about Lü Dazhong, Lü Dalin, Lü Dafang. These people who were engaged in the collection of these materials, their graves were found. Their literal, Lü Dalin's grave, for instance, is discovered. And it's a fascinating site. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but Lü Dalin's grave has three tiers. The first two are empty. So they're designed to trick the tomb robbers and be like, open it, it's empty, right? But the last one is at the very bottom. So here you can see that the way that they constructed their tombs, they very much had in mind what was going on in Xi'an at the time. Obviously there were a lot of tomb diggers and digging down into tombs and collecting stuff. And so as collectors, they were trying to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, tomb diggers still found Lü Dalin's tomb and it was still robbed. So it didn't work.
Too bad. So our next question from Eric Lee. With regard to militarization, could you give a longer view? It seems from the Tang to early Ming, the wars and borderland struggles had consistently been forcing various regimes to militarize the region.
Mm-hmm.
How would you put this militarization in larger historical and geographical context?
Yeah, this is one of the most important things that I need to think more about, because like you said, right, in the Tang, you have a big city, but like the Tang city itself really can't defend it against anyone. So when the Tibetans come, the emperors were fled, and it would flee. And when the various rebels come, the emperors would flee. Chang'an really didn't function as a defense unit. But in the Song, this is the place where the Song was organizing the military force against the Xixia. And you have a lot of records about the construction. So Sima Guang has a famous letter about the maintenance and the construction of the provincial the city, or the Song city in Chang'an. But this didn't stop in the northern Song. Between the Song-Jin transition, this region changed hand a few times. So it was conquered by the Jin, and Jin gave it back to the Song, and then it was conquered again. So you can imagine it became a constant borderland. So in that period, obviously, it also accelerated this process of militarization. And then in the Yuan and the Ming, you have the new phenomenon of these princes coming to the city and having a separate unit near the city. So the city itself wasn't the primary sort of defense. Instead, you have these princes like the Anxi Wang, the son of Kublai, and then in the Ming, the son of Zhu Yuanzhang, coming here and kind of trying to build some sort of a structure. And then in the Qing, obviously, you have a very large Manchu banner city within the city. So there absolutely is a longer story of militarization that I will include in the project.
Thank you. And our next question from Professor Bettine Birch. Wonderful talk. I especially like your use of material evidence, and I find your conclusions very convincing. Do you think there be a contrasting narrative from the government's perspective? And what kinds of rebuilding did each dynasty regime undertake? If we look at the material building of different eras, might we get an alternate narrative?
Thank you very much. So the alternative narrative would be that, I sort of mentioned this a little bit, the Song government did try to rebuild certain sites that had something to do with the Tang emperors. So the shrine for Emperor Taizong, Emperor a few, like at least 5 or 6 Tang emperors, the early Song state did try to rebuild them. And we still have the stones for the for instance the Chongqiu Tangdaizong Miaobei, so the shrine, the stele for the reconstruction of the shrine for Emperor Taizong. But these things, again, relatively speaking, because they were so far, they were built in connection to the imperial mausoleum, so they were all very far to the north. They seem to have had little impact on the residents of Chang'an. I have not found a single record of that, a narrative record that tells me that these people in Chang'an were going to these shrines and visiting them. There are inscriptions on the stones that show that yes, indeed, there absolutely were people doing that. But again, the overwhelming interest seems to have been in the other direction. So that's one contrast. But I think a clearer contrast is that there is absolutely no interest in recovering the history of Chang'an as the what we now know it as the cosmopolitan empire, right? There's no stone inscription from any of the non-Chinese religious institutions. The famous Nestorian Christian stele was moved in the city from not from the region of the city, but really somewhere Zhouzhi, from quite far away, from a different Nestorian monastery. So the Nestorian churches and Zoroastrian temples in the city, essentially in the Song and the subsequent dynasties, I mean, they must have also had their monuments. They must have also had their inscriptions, but there seemed to be no interest in collecting any of these.
Interesting. So Wenxing, we still have, I think, final 3 questions left.
Yeah, we can answer them. I mean, there are people still here. Like I'm very moved.
Well, we all attracted by your very exciting Q&A. So our next question from Mei Zhang. I wonder if natural landscape and the terrain surrounding the city and Chang'an's connection with other major cities or important transportation lines also exert a significant influence on how later people traveled to the city and remembered the city.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I'm going to just show you one example. Wait, let's see if I have that book open. This is the map of Xi'an in the later period. This is the Ming Dynasty Xi'an, right? So you're saying connections to other places. How did that shape?
Xing, are you going to share your screen?
Yeah. No, I am right away.
Oh, okay.
Sure. I'm just saying you are talking about how the shape, how the connection to other places shaped the city. Look at the city in the Ming Dynasty. This is the city, but they built this additional chunk because obviously Xi'an's connection now is mostly to the east, or people like to travel to the east. And there's this additional chunk that's built that you don't see in other directions. So, if we get to a little bit more metaphysical, it's almost like in the Tang, the empire is looking a bit to the west, whereas this is Valerie Hansen's textbook, Open Empire, has a very nice way of describing this period as China looking west, and then after the Tang, China looking north. You can almost see manifestation of that in the space, in the local sort of regional landscape of Xi'an, in a sense that the west of the city as a whole, the development seems to have stalled.
Interesting, thank you. So our next question from Kai Yu Li. Could you talk about the Imperial City Renaissance project? Why the city decided to start this project?
And then I wonder, if you know anything about the project in Taiyuan. I don't know the project in Taiyuan. I mean, the reason that I need to look, I looked at their documents a bit, right? But I need to look closer into them. The reason is mostly to attract tourism, to attract tourists. Because the thing that very many people are disappointed in, and this is something that I kind of felt a very sense of a strange sense of disappointment, because so I'm from the region. I'm from a city to the west of Xi'an, Baoji. I grew up in Baoji, about 2 hours drive west of Xi'an. One of the things that people always talk about is that, oh, Xi'an is like this famous, you know, capital, like how many dynasties, Gudu, right? Gudu of 10 dynasties. But when you actually go to Xi'an, there's like nothing in the city. There's just the Dayenta. There's just that one pagoda, nothing else to see. And the sites are all outside the city, either the terracotta warriors, or the you know, if you go to the mausoleum, it's very far, or if you go to the Famen Temple, right? These famous and the Huajingzhi, the pond where, you know, Emperor Xuanzong and Yang consort Yang supposedly bathed. These places, these famous sites were all outside the city. I think the goal is to attract tourists into the city, because in the 90s, when I was growing up, there's nothing to see in the Daming Gong, in the Daming Palace. It's just a dirt stump. Now, obviously, it becomes a site where people can go, and inside there's like a miniature reproduction of the palace, so you can sort of walk around and, you know, dressed as a Tang person. So I think it's mostly for that kind of thing.
Right. So our last question from Professor Ming Li again. Did any Jingyuan literati assume a perspective different from the Central Plains perspective of the Tang Song?
I would say the only person that I see doing this, and again, you know, the Jin sources is hard because there isn't any one written source about Chang'an in the Jin, but we can see from the perspective of Luo Tianxiang, who wrote the Leibian Chang'an, who collected this gazetteer of Chang'an by categories. People don't usually value this book very much because it's usually seen as a recharacterization. I mean, he says this as much in the preface, that I'm just trying to recategorize Song Minqiu's book into categories, like turn it into almost like a lei shu so that it's easy for you to read. But he does add stuff to Song Minqiu. And the most interesting thing he adds is the last chapter of the book, which is a catalog of the stone inscriptions that he witnessed in the region, and including the ones that he saw in beilin. So in that sense, I do see that, you know, Luo Tianxiang as a local, he was a regional, he was the teacher at the provincial college. From his perspective, what he was interested in was quite different from what the, you know, the Yuan emperor, you know, the Kublai Khan. I suspect Kublai Khan was probably not very interested in these Chinese literati, right? So in that sense, yes, the Jin situation, you still I still need to read a bit more Jin sort of collection of writings to try to recover that.
Okay, I think we're at the end of our questions. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank you.
Xi'an, for answering our question. And thank you so much for taking the time to show us such
Yeah,
a
thank you.
rich and diverse array of materials, and also for opening up this new direction in urban studies, urban history. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you all for the wonderful questions. And if you have additional questions or any other comments or suggestions, again, this is a very, at a very early stage, please write to me. It's my name, Xinwen at princeton.edu, and I look forward to hearing from you. And again, thank you, Huijun, thank you, Professor Barry, and thank you, Esther.
Thank you so much.
Hope you have a good evening.